colleagues, students, friends, thank you for joining us this evening. And the presence of so many of you is certainly testimony to the importance of this topic, the fact that you've decided to share your evening or your lunchtime with us. So we hope very much to add to the discussion that has been happening. And as we noted in advertising this event, what we really want to do is not only bring an informed academic discussion to you, but also to shift the focus away a little bit and shift it away from what have been very much the dominant framings of what has been happening as largely a contest between the US and Russia and simply a game of great power geopolitics. So this is what we will try to do. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz. I'm a political geographer, and I'm also the academic co-director of ACES, the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, that is hosting tonight's event. And I will act as moderator and try to bring to you what, as I said, will be a different take on what has been occurring over the past weeks and months. As I said, what we want to do especially is to shift, let's say, attention away from simply this contest of great power geopolitics. And as I said, it is of course also that, but what has been lost in most of these discussions is Ukraine and Ukrainians that have become simply an object of others' geopolitical agendas, whether Russia's, the US's, or in smaller part, the European Union's. And I think one of the things that has been troubling many of us is that in these discussions, Ukraine has become simply a symbol, and equally so for all sides, if we may call them that. Whether the ultimate battleground for Western liberal values, if we are to read some US commentators, a pawn to be traded, as some EU states stand accused of doing, or the last stand for the protection of a Russian defense space in its near abroad. And what is lost in these representations, in fact, is any appreciation of the positioning of Ukraine and of Ukrainians themselves, their own geopolitical and geoeconomic orientations, wishes, their own visions of a desirable European security order, since that has become the buzzword in the past weeks. And so to bring Ukraine, but also Europe back into the discussion, what we've wanted to do is to invite a panel of colleagues who've been conducting empirical research in Ukraine over the past decade, if not decades, and whose expertise we hope can help us better understand all the other things that are also at stake in this crisis beyond great power competition. So I don't want to take up too much more time. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the structure of tonight's evening. We've asked all of the speakers to begin with a 5 to 7 minute opening presentation. We will then give them a chance to quickly respond to each other, so kind of a second round, and then we will move on to questions from you in the audience. Those of you who are following us on Zoom, you can type your questions into the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Please use that rather than the chat, just so we can keep a better track of it. And those of you who are following us on YouTube on the live stream, you should be able to also submit your questions there, and one of our colleagues will forward them to the panel. So let me stop there and introduce to you the first speaker of tonight's discussion, my colleague Olia Bolyuk, who is Assistant Professor of Europe's External Relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And she has done research for quite some time now on the role of the EU, in transforming states and societies in Eastern Europe, in the post-Soviet space, in Ukraine and Russia, more specifically looking both at questions of promotion of democracy, questions of rule of law and human rights, but also trade and development cooperation. So Olia, the floor is yours, and we will be looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for joining. I will jump right into it. First of all, perhaps by way of a side note, but also taking advantage of the fact that I'm speaking as the first in the lineup tonight, I would like to take a moment to point out that even though we have settled on labeling the situation the Ukraine crisis, it is important to remember that it is not a Ukraine crisis by virtue of Ukraine doing something or by something being done by Ukraine or by something happening in Ukraine, but it is rather a Ukraine crisis by virtue of what might be happening or be done to Ukraine by Russia. This event tonight is very much about images and imaginations, frames and labels. And I was thinking that actually labeling the situation the Russia crisis would have been perhaps much more accurate and also much more productive in terms of looking for, solutions, the ways out, and so on. And I believe that the fact that we do call it the Ukraine crisis and don't call it the Russia crisis is in fact a big win for Russia in the information war. Now, on the current situation and the imminent threat of full-scale invasion by Russia in Ukraine, the way I see it, it's at the same time unprecedented, but also perfectly within the pattern. It's unprecedented in the sense that we have one European country amassing troops on the borders of another European country and threatening full-on invasion in what is a purely offensive move. At the very least, it's used for blackmail, and possibly it might actually happen. And you'd think this to be unthinkable in the 21st century, but apparently it is thinkable enough to warrant evacuation of the diplomatic troops and also the fleeing of Ukraine by a long list of Ukraine's own political business elites or, who are evacuating their families and so on. So it's unprecedented in the fact that we actually are talking about this for real in this time and place. It is, however, perfectly within the pattern, not new in that we observe, as Luisa has pointed out, we observe again Ukraine being downplayed, sidelined, and occasionally actually omitted altogether, be it in high-level negotiations or analysis or even more so media coverage thereof. And this omission is actually so thorough and so skillful and so absurd that you could almost call it beautiful. It's beautifully done in the sense of how perilously this illusion works. And ironically, then, Ukraine is there in the name of the crisis. It's carrying the name of the crisis, and it is there in the behind-the-scenes diplomatic work. Actually, earlier today, a friend from Kiev, who's a political analyst in Kiev, said, "Oh, judging by the number of high-level visitors, Ukraine is the center of the world at the moment." But at the same, and it is the one who will bear the consequences, whether there is invasion or not. Even in the absence of invasion, Ukraine is bearing the consequences. But it is somehow not there among the big players, who are taking the real decisions on the situation. And when Ukraine is included, it's often included in the capacity of an observer rather than an agent of change, as a secondary rather than a primary actor, as an object rather than a subject, and labeled as a territory and not a country. And just earlier today, I was reading some analysis on, or like a call, like stop calling Ukraine a small country. It's actually a large country. And perhaps you've seen these memes circulating, placing Ukraine on the map of Europe and placing it on the map of Ukraine. And I was thinking, actually, Russia has managed to do this logical step of, by virtue of being a big country, treating itself as a great country. And now it's trying to do the exact same, just the opposite way for Ukraine by trying to, communicate this message of Ukraine being a small country to it being somehow therefore and thereby insignificant, right? So there is this kind of logical illusion happening. Several years ago, a good friend and colleague of mine, Yosa Musliu, and we worked on the meta-narratives of Ukraine and how these could be traced back in the Euromaidan slogans and the coverage thereof. And I would suggest that actually a similar exercise could be done with what is going on at the moment with the current escalation and the discourses found in that. And the four meta-narratives we've identified then were Ukraine as a liminal category between East and West. The second, Ukraine as Russia as non-Russia. The third, Ukraine as Europe, non-Europe. And the fourth, Ukraine as Ukraine. And if you look at the international discussions, media coverage, Western opinions, and what do we know in the West, it's usually the first, followed by the second and the third, often in the context of the first. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, what the public opinion is, and where the people who are being agents of change, what they believe, it's usually actually Ukraine as Ukraine. And the content, the point of this narrative is that it places responsibility for Ukraine's present and future in its own hands. And therefore, to an extent, abundance reliance on help from the outside, right? Or at least sees it as instrumental. Now, and if we look at what's happening now in the past weeks or months with the escalation on the borders, you see that the exact same thing is happening, right? It's the first narrative of Ukraine being a bridge, a borderland, a no man's land, just like a territory there for grabs. It kind of dominates the discourse. And then the narratives of whether Ukraine is essentially the same with Russia or the same with Europe is, semi-independent, but also within that big context of where should the bridge be leaning, left or right. But if you look at what happenings in Ukraine, if I see on my, Facebook timeline and my Twitter timeline, and what people are posting and what people are, how they're expressing themselves at the moment, it's very much about Ukraine as Ukraine, and Ukrainians just essentially relying on themselves. They're quietly preparing for war. They're packing up their emergency kits, their backpacks. They are continuing business as usual to the extent that's possible. Someone was just posting, we might be invaded on Wednesday, but for now, all 4 of my kids are going to school and I'm going to work, kind of trying to continue with that. A significant shift has taken place in the collective imagination of Ukrainians these past weeks, however, and perhaps other speakers will pick up on that later on. And that shift is that the attack on Kyiv is now actually within the scope of the thinkable. And just recently, it was within the scope of the unthinkable. So Russian aggression, Russian invasion is no longer mentally limited to the east of Ukraine, confined to that area, but people, nowhere in Ukraine can you feel safe, basically. And this will have and is already having, I would argue, profound implications. And I was just looking at the public opinion poll by the Democratic Initiatives Foundation of last week. And somewhere between 2 and 8% of Ukrainians believe that anything can appease Russia at the moment, that there is any compromise that would be a guarantee of peace for Ukraine. It's really a marginal percentage of people. Whereas 43% of Ukrainians said that they are ready to engage personally in case of further Russian invasion, either by joining the army or by, committing that time or by joining in the kind of para-troops, paramilitary things. So, just the thought of it might happen, whether it happens or not, is already having significant implications. I would like to end by pointing out one more obvious, just like I did at the beginning, that the current escalation is not a one-off event. It is a step in a long sequence. And even if Russia would now withdraw its forces partially or completely, there have been some speculations earlier today that might be happening. The conflict will not be exhausted and the subject will not be closed. That's it for me. I think this is very much an opening remark for the rest of the speakers, not just for myself. And I'm looking forward to hear what others have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olya. And actually that was a perfect opening remark, because I think it's touched upon a lot of the questions that I hope also our other colleagues will address, and I think the very first point you made of Ukraine as Ukraine rather than Ukraine as simply Russia, non-Russia, or Europe, non-Europe is a very important one, because that has been entirely lost. But I don't want to take up the time of the speakers, so let me introduce you to our second speaker of tonight, Professor Michael Kimmage, who is Professor of History at the Catholic University of America. His most recent book is entitled The Abandonment of the West. And he's written many other wonderful things, including on Philip Roth. Some of you in the audience may know his other work. He also has a policy background from 2014 through 2016. He served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the US Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Luisa, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to have this, what I think is an extremely valuable conversation about Ukraine and Europe at this fraught moment, and one where the conversation, as has already been indicated, is often far too categorical and far too simplistic. So it's wonderful to have the chance to look into these questions with nuance and with academic rigor, I hope. I want to make in my presentation 3 points. The first about Europe, the second about the 1990s and the legacy of the 1990s, and the third about Ukraine. And I'll dive right in with my first point about Europe. There's a great deal to say about Europe. We're all familiar with its mythological origins, going back into Greek antiquity. And I would like to say, in the spirit of intellectual celebration, how much I appreciate this enormous sprawling quality of Europe, of its real endlessness, and the impossibility of defining whatever it is that we mean by Europe. And even when we carve Europe into the 4 points of the compass, Northern Europe, is that Scandinavia? Is that Frankfurt? Is it Milan? It's quite difficult to say. Eastern Europe, is that Vilnius? Is that Vladivostok? Is it Vienna? Southern Europe, is that Munich? Probably it is Rome and Athens and Madrid, but you can ask questions about that as well. And Western Europe too is sort of wonderfully indeterminate. And one could add one further point about this enormity of Europe, this pleasant enormity of Europe, which is that it's also a global dynamic. So I think of myself, perhaps improbably and perhaps wrongly, as somebody who lives in Europe because I live on the East Coast of the United States. And there's so many European elements here in the architecture, the cuisine, the culture, the history. I recalled the slogan of Cafe Lola. Perhaps some of you have been on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It has the phrase on its menus, this is the cafe that Europeans wish was in Europe. And I think that the implication of that menu slogan is that the cafe is so European that Europeans wish that they had it in Europe. So there too, you can say Europe extends as far as the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and certainly to many places in Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. So that's my first point. This is in a way, I think, how Europe should be, a kind of endless quality that we can endlessly debate and discuss and think about in terms of its borders and boundaries and definitions. Nevertheless, my second point will contradict my first. And the second point, and I don't mean to speak too critically here, but I think there's something to think about critically in this domain. In the 1990s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, what happened, as we all know, was the rapid extension of what you could describe as institutional Europe, which certainly can be defined, from west to east. And so this would be most importantly the spread of the EU to certain places in Central and Eastern Europe, and likewise the spread of NATO to certain places in Eastern and Central Europe. I don't mean to say that this was a bad thing or to argue against it or to polemicize against NATO or the EU. Not at all. There are lots of sort of virtues and benefits that came from the expansion of these two important European institutions. But I think the negative, unforeseen negative consequence of this rapid expansion of institutional Europe is that you get the motif, which is now ringing in our ears, of joining Europe. And the EU and NATO, in important ways, came to define Europe. We speak of Brussels as the sort of the representative of Europe. What does Europe have to say about this? And maybe that's Paris, maybe it's Berlin, maybe it's London, but Brussels, can really sort of figure quite importantly in that role. And of course, Brussels does speak for the European Union, but that's not quite the same as saying that it speaks for Europe. And the same is the case with NATO. It's a very important European institution. But with all the countries that are not members, it's hard to say that NATO maps perfectly onto whatever it is that's Europe. And the tragedy of joining Europe and this motif of joining Europe is that some countries join and some countries don't join. Some countries can join and some countries can't join. And that's not just a linguistic problem. I think it's a problem of attitude and mentality. I don't think that we realize how much we've constrained and confined and limited the map of Europe by confusing it really with the dimensions of institutional Europe. And so I'll just make one very quick point about Ukraine here and sort of say a few other words about that by way of conclusion. Ukraine can't join Europe, I would argue, because Ukraine is Europe. And so you really confuse the issue in some fundamental way by framing it around whether Ukraine can join or not join. I know that Ukraine and NATO is a very important question, which we should discuss in sort of other parameters, and Ukraine and the European Union is an equally important question to be discussed in other parameters. But you can't join something that you are. And I think that that's led us down certain unfortunate intellectual and cultural pathways. That sense of joining Europe and the exclusions that follow in the wake of this motif. Sort of third and final point. We have the OSCE, which in geopolitics or institutional politics could be larger, of course, than the EU and NATO. It doesn't seem to, in practice, function that way. I wonder in the future if that's not worth thinking of as something of an in-between answer to the Europe that one can join and the larger Europe. But I would speak going forward in the future in defense of two principles when it comes to Ukraine and Europe and other countries that are in a similar position. I would include Russia in this category very much as well. Russia is Europe too. It's not a place that Russia can join or sort of choose. It's in many ways organically a part of the European story. And vice versa. But I think that there are two definitions that we can use to broaden our mind at the moment. And one is loosely geographic. In this sense, I will have to give up on my dream of being in Europe while on the East Coast, because after all, the United States and North America is not really Europe and can only pretend to be, sort of truly a part of the European world. But of course, Ukraine, geographically, we could argue, is at the heart of Europe. It's the sort of center of Europe in many respects, in a kind of literal sense, but other ways, historical, cultural, etc. You can sort of figure Ukraine into the center of European geography, and I think that's well worth doing. It sort of opens the mind to think both of Ukraine and Europe in those terms. And here's the point that I'll make by way of my sort of real conclusion, that there's another Europe that we really have to remember, especially as geopolitics has come to the fore and notions of war and division have become so powerful in recent months and weeks. And this is Europe as the Republic of Letters. And here, I think geography really doesn't matter. If you wish to participate, if you have that sort of connection to Erasmus or to Greek philosophy, or to any of the beautiful manifestations of European intellectual culture that constitute what we've thought of since the 18th century as the Republic of Letters, then again, you don't need to join. You can be a part of that republic. You can be a citizen of that republic. In that republic, citizenship should be as open as possible. And there, I think, too, you can say Ukraine is not in the position of having to join Europe. Again, Ukraine is Europe. So geography and the Republic of Letters are two things that take us in a different direction from the contemporary conversation about both the European Union and NATO. There, over and out.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for reminding us also, of other geographies than the ones that have, kind of certainly taken over, colonized the contemporary debate, where the lines are very neatly and clearly drawn. Gerard, speaking of geography, so I'll turn to a geographer. So our next speaker is Gerard Toll, who's a political geographer, founder of Critical Geopolitics, and we have many students in the audience who have been forced into reading your book, so they will recognize you, certainly by name. Gerard is Professor of International Affairs at Virginia Tech's Greater Washington campus right now. His last book, many of you will be familiar with, it's Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest for Ukraine and the Caucasus, which won the International Studies Association ENMIA Distinguished Book Award. And he's currently working on his next book, entitled Oceans Rise, Empires Fall, Theorizing Geopolitics as an Earth in Crisis. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Louisa, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I'm very happy to be part of this distinguished group, and I've enjoyed the presentation so far. What I want to do is to speak as a political geographer, not as a Ukraine expert, but to try to place in context some of the things that we're seeing here in a broader context. And so I want to begin with this particular diagram, which is from the book that Louisa mentioned, Near Abroad, and argue that what we're seeing here is a situation of decolonization, but an imperfect one. That metaphor is different in terms of how it operates with respect to Ukraine and Russia because of the intimate nature of the connections between Ukraine and Russia during the Tsarist Empire and during the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, it is one that we have to think about. And so you have a metropolitan state that is coming to terms, often with great difficulty, with the independence of a former subordinate territory, which was sometimes seen as part of the mother country. And you have a nationalizing elite within that state that's seeking to take the state in a new direction, seeking to assert self-determination, autonomy, and is interested in integrating with an external normative power. Here, the term Euro-Atlantic, which is one that was hovering on the edges of what Michael was saying, as a term that describes NATO and also the European Union, both headquartered in Brussels. But as I pointed out in the book Near Abroad, that term originally was an encompassing one that wasn't necessarily associated with liberalism. It was associated with the larger space, Eurasia and Europe, but it came to be defined really as the agenda of NATO and of the European Union. And so expanding Europe or Europeanizing became associated with that. And I think Michael is absolutely correct in sort of underscoring the problems, the tremendous problems that has caused. But what I want to focus in on here is the fact that Ukraine did not have a secessionist region when the Soviet Union collapsed. But as a consequence of the events of 2014, that secessionist region was created in the Donbass and was created by military intervention, military support on the part of the Russian state for some separatist forces there, but also they infused those separatist forces with outside imperial nationalists from Russia who came in and helped seize particular buildings at the outside, including in Kharkiv, and they were subsequently ousted from there, as everyone knows. So that was a situation that was created. And so if we're to talk about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, we could talk about it as a series of changes in Russia's theory as to how it controls Ukraine. And the dominant theory, the sort of theory 1.0, was that Russia would be a force that would intervene in the Ukrainian political field and tilt it in a way that supported candidates that were sympathetic to Russia. And of course, to call Yanukovych pro-Russian is insufficient because he was more than that, but nevertheless, he was a candidate who was backed twice very personally by Putin, and the first time resulted in the Orange Revolution and the humiliation of that for Putin. And then the second time, of course, he is ousted by the Euromaidan protests and flees. So that particular policy failed. Now, there are other aspects where Russia retains influence in the field, in the economic field, especially in Ukraine. Viktor Medvedchuk and his particular role in Ukraine is sort of part of that. But the sort of controlling the political tilt, that policy fell. And as many have said, Russia seized Crimea and lost Ukraine. And it sort of toxified the relationship between Russia and Ukraine because of the blatant intervention by Russia. And so then Russia went to a second theory, which was to use the Donbass as a territorial lever and the Minsk process as a territorial lever in order to control the geopolitical orientation of Ukraine. And of course, the actual mechanism by which that was to be worked out was part of the Minsk process, but it never really got going. And in effect, it stalemated in part because of the power of the nationalist faction within Ukraine that threatens a third Maidan against any Ukrainian leader who would be capitulating to Russia on that. And as a consequence, we have this stalemate and failure. And so we're at this inflection point where it's unclear whether we're going to go to a 3.0 theory, in which you have a violent display on the part of Russia, an invasion, small, medium, or large, but it's all horrible in terms of the situation that Ukraine faces right now. But I wanted to sort of set that up as the particular moment we're in. Then we come to the Donbass. So how do we conceptualize the Donbass? Well, I think it's a series of nested conflicts, but the Donbass is really at the center of it. That particular conflict then touches on the question of the nationalizing state and the conflict within Ukraine between visions of Ukraine. And one of the things that I would say in response to Olga, when she says, okay, Ukraine is left out, but which Ukraine is it? There is a sort of an ongoing vision of what Ukraine is, and one particular vision has won out at the current moment. And that's part of what is at stake in this conflict. So as a geographer, I want to sort of give us a broader, thicker understanding of the conflict. And not so much getting away from great power politics, but showing that great power politics can actually be grounded in certain places, and that it's then is connected to these much larger sets of questions. This is it in greater detail. I'm using the Ukraine crisis in inverted commas. I think the points that Olga made at the beginning are very well made. But there are these larger levels, and Europe is involved in every one of them. So Europe's entangled in all of them in terms of the Normandy format and the particulars of that, but also Europe as an identity politics here, and that playing into the nationalizing state, because there's a certain vision of Europe which is a sort of exclusivist one, which is associated with rather nationalistic policies, which can be racially exclusive, can be associated with Christian identity and the like. And there's a far right element that we have to talk about in relationship to Europe and a particular vision that they're promoting of Europe. The interstate conflict that we have between Ukraine and Russia, between Ukraine and Russia, involves NATO training and NATO weapons. That's very much has entangled NATO, even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but there is a certain NATOization with the admission of Ukraine into enhanced opportunity program. Then you have the larger geostrategic conflict. You have the question concerning sanctions and Nord Stream 2 and gas. And then lastly, but not least, the notion of a civilizational conflict, which gets at the great power politics and gets at the US-Russian relationship. I probably spoke for longer than I should have, so I apologize for that. But I wanted to sort of convey to you how there's a very sort of interlocked, spatially interconnected set of scales working here. And so that we have to have a sort of a thick understanding of the geopolitics at work. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Jared. And indeed, I mean, one of the things that we hope to do is to, kind of get us to think about these nested scales, not just of what is happening right now, but also of, kind of both the grand geopolitical narratives and of identity narratives, which are absolutely intertwined. So I think we might be coming back to your diagram at some later point in the discussion, no doubt. So let me pass on to our next speaker, who's also a political geographer, John O'Loughlin, who is College Professor of Distinction at the University of Colorado Boulder. And he has been working for over 30 years, gosh, on very similar questions, looking at the former Soviet Union, looking at changing geopolitical orientations, territorial separatism, de facto states, along with a variety of spatial analyses of conflict, both in the former Soviet Union and in Africa. The most recent research that he has been doing and that he'll be speaking to us about today looks exactly at the geopolitical orientations of the residents of former Soviet states, including Ukraine, and also views of Russia, of the West, of Europe, and preferences, hopes for foreign policy. Jono is one of the founding editors of Political Geography, and we're really happy to have him with us. Jono, floor is yours. And I believe you'll be sharing your screen as well.
I hope so. Thank you, Louisa. Hello to everybody from Colorado. It's sunny, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. And Jared just set up this brief presentation for me quite well, so I don't need to do much of an introduction. But I will say a couple of things in terms of how I approach research. First of all, I'm a believer in the power of big numbers. That's pretty obvious, and Louisa and I have talked about that, among others. But secondly, this data I'm going to present comes from a survey just over 2 years ago, a national survey in Ukraine. And I think the key point here is, as Jared said, rather than talking about Ukraine as a territorial unit or as a polity in a classic political science sense, I think we need to look more deeply or more carefully at its composition. And so I'm going to, and we've published, quite a bit about the various elements of this project, but it was a wide-ranging survey, not only in Ukraine, but in actually 10 other former Soviet countries and territories. But I'll focus on Ukraine today, and I'll focus especially on this idea of how European do Ukrainians think they are? I mean, in other words, how does the kind of geocultural element come into the political preferences? So I'm going to try and share my screen. Louisa, let me know if it works. If not, I'm sure you'll let me know. Is it working?
Perfect. Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I have a few slides to share. And as I said, we have lots of questions in the survey about geopolitical orientations and political questions and war experiences and so on and so forth. But we also have questions about cultural values and cultural preferences and so on. And we have questions such as, I'm a member or I connect to the Russian civilization, I connect to Western civilization. But I want to kind of just highlight a couple of questions that come with respect to the whole European orientation. We have a proposition, a question, and ask people to agree or disagree with this proposition. And it's a very, obviously what we're getting at here is the possibility, the counter to the marriage should only be between a man and a woman, which is that others who are, outside of this normative view of marriage only a man and a woman, to what extent people agree or disagree with it. And you can see the results for Ukraine here broken down by the usual macro regions of Ukraine: west, center, north, south, and east. And by just comparison, I stick in the data for Crimea because we also surveyed in Crimea at the same time as in Ukraine. And the overwhelming impression you take from this is that this is a conservative society. It's 90% across the board in all regions, between those who strongly agree with this proposition. There's no difference really between Ukraine and Crimea, and there's really not much difference in across the four macro regions of Ukraine if you combine the two categories. And then if you look at it by age, you would think that there should be a significant age difference, right? Age group difference. So the younger people are more likely to disagree, to oppose this proposition. But in fact, there's not really much. There's a slight gradation from younger age groups to older age groups, but in fact, it's not significant. And by the way, just as a matter of comparison, these results line up similar results in Kazakhstan, in Belarus, in Georgia, in Armenia, and in Moldova. You get these very conservative views of marriage. So I want to then kind of turn to this because this is really the focus of our discussion today. And I want to kind of disaggregate in a way that Jared suggested that we need to, rather than talking about a unitary whole. And so we have, again, a series of propositions where people can agree or disagree with them. And to remind you, this is the Ukrainian data here. And this is a very important point that's been emphasized by Volodymyr Ishenko and others, is that when you're talking about survey results in Ukraine, you have to be very careful about which part of the country you're talking about, because currently people don't survey in Crimea, and they don't survey in the non-government control parts of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So in a sense, it exaggerates, in a sense, I think, generally the kind of pro-West, pro-European data. The ratios, the percentages are much higher than they would be if Crimea and the Donbass non-government controlled areas were included. So having said that, our data also are for the Ukraine without those two non-government controlled areas. So here are the results. To what extent people agree with this proposition. I see myself as a European. I've changed the macro regional categories a little bit here because I wanted to take out the Donbass, the areas of Donbass which are controlled by the Kyiv government, right? The western side of those two oblasts. And then the east is Kharkiv and Dnipro, and then the rest of it is basically the same. And again, you see a very, very nice regional progression, right? The blue bars go down as you move to the right, as you move to the east. The red bars go up as you move to the right. Again, not terribly surprising. But what's interesting about this, I think, is that if you look at the blue bars, it's only in the west of Ukraine that is more than 50% of the population who say they see themselves as a European, right? Even in the center north area, which is the Kyiv region and surrounding oblasts, it's less than 50%, and then it drops off consistently thereafter. So this regional difference, we're not the first ones to emphasize it. I first wrote about it I think in the late 1990s. It's a very important element in the kind of political fabric of Ukraine, obviously, but it's also a very important element in the kind of geopolitical orientations of the country. So as a good geographer, which I hope I am, the macro regions are good, but they're not great in terms of looking at the east-west differences. So instead, I think this is a better graphic. So those of you who remember your regression from the old days will see what's going on here. So what I did was on the horizontal axis is the road distance from each of the oblast capitals to the nearest EU border crossing point. Okay, for most of them, it's the crossing point just west of Lviv, but not all. There's a couple in Romania. And then on the vertical axis is the percent of respondents in each oblast who say they feel European, right? And then you best fit a regression line from these 2 pieces of information. So what this tells us and what this shows us is a very strong west to east gradient. The dots here, the size of the dot is proportional to the sample point in the oblast. Every oblast here has at least 75 respondents, and some of them, very large, like Kyiv and Lviv and so on, have well over 150. But you can see, again, a nice west-east progression, but then there are some places which are higher and lower than the line. So what this tells you, for example, is that Lviv, more people think of themselves as European in Lviv than you would expect based on the overall national trend, right? The same thing is true of Kyiv, of Dnipro. Kharkiv is right on the line. Lugansk is right on the line. In Odessa and Donetsk, it's much lower than the line, which indicates that far fewer people there think of themselves as European based on their distance to the European border. So this is the kind of geography of Ukraine that doesn't get a huge amount of attention. I think it needs more attention. It's, again, based on survey data, but there are many other indicators too of kind of orientation to Europe and orientation to the West. And I guess I would like to stop there and just bring these data to your attention. Thank you, Louisa.
Thanks so much for that. And, again, I think continuing on our discussion of what is the Europe that we're talking about? And we might come back to you to, to dig further at this data and these questions. I mean, what do people take Europe to be in this question? I mean, how on earth do they understand that? But I have a feeling we'll come back to that question. So let me pass on to our next presenter, Nicola Martoric, who is not a geographer. He is many things, actually has a very wide background. He's currently a postdoc researcher at the Institute of Communications and Media Research at the University of Bern. But some of you may know him from his time at UVA, so it's lovely to have you back, at least in virtual form. And the reason I'm saying it's difficult to define Nicola's work is because his work is very wide-ranging, from media studies to examining questions of artificial intelligence. His PhD work also was very much grounded in trauma and memory studies, in digital remembrance, but he's also done work on cybersecurity and critical security studies. So a very wide range of research, but looking most recently and very importantly at algorithmic profiling and the making of news communities in Ukraine. And so how quite distinct news and media bubbles are made. So Nicola, I hope that was a wide-ranging enough introduction to the many wonderful things you do. So the floor is yours. And I believe you're going to share some slides as well. Great.
Thank you very much, Luisa. And especially thank you very much for actually putting an excellent job into making my relatively inconsistent CV actually looking more or less consistent. So I hope that you can actually see my slides, because at least for me, I'm slightly stuck, but slightly I'm going to be unstuck. So I will briefly talk about some projects that we are doing specifically in the context of the news platforms and also algorithms in Ukraine. And pretty much, as Luisa noted, we are definitely doing quite some things, both back in my days in Amsterdam, but also currently in my days in Bern. And I'm also very happy to do some of these fantastic jobs with my wonderful co-authors, Alexander Uyman, Mariela Bastian, and also Mariela Weimars, who is coming from quite a few European Union countries. And as I already noted, we're specifically focusing on three things: on the social media and news consumption in Ukraine, on news personalization, and we'll definitely talk what news personalization is about very briefly, and finally the search algorithm, which is our most recent toy, which we are playing with right now. So first of all, let me actually show you some nice bubbles, which Luisa promised actually. So this bubble actually comes from one of the projects that we were doing together with Alexander, my colleague from Zurich, when we actually looked at the news consumption in Ukraine in VKontakte. And I guess that quite some people here actually know that VKontakte was banned quite some years ago because of it assumingly propagating Russian narratives and Russian propaganda. However, the platform remains pretty heavily used, I would say, even despite the ban. It's actually one of the points that I would return more briefly in the end of my talk. And what we actually try to do here is we actually try to collect some data about the people who self-identify as Ukrainians on the specific social network, which is coming from Russia. And that's what we did. We actually looked at what kind of news communities they're subscribed to. And what we're actually seeing on those wonderful bubbles is that we can actually identify at least two very distinct clusters, which is the green cluster would be the, I would say, pro-insurgent Republic news groups, as well as very much pro-Russian news groups, whereas the purple bubble on the right would actually be pro-Ukrainian news groups. And as you can easily see, they definitely do not overlapping that much. They're very distinct. And what you're having in between is, to a certain degree, more football-related news and also more legacy media news. So what it actually suggests to us is that there is definitely quite some, I would say, disengagement between people who prefer to read pro-Russian news and also people who prefer to read pro-Ukrainian news on VKontakte. And I would say that probably we can also expect similar ideological segregation on other social networks, such as Facebook and Twitter, that already raises quite some questions, okay? What we can actually do under those circumstances when actually having very strong divide between people from Ukraine in terms of the information they consume and also interpretation of the ongoing events that they are happening. Another project that we are doing together with Marielle from Maastricht was about the perception of news personalization in Ukraine. It is, as I promised, I'm definitely going to introduce it briefly. So news personalization is pretty much about the use of algorithmic systems. Think about the recommender systems, something that you're getting when you're coming to the Amazon, and Amazon offers you suggestions about what next book you actually want to buy, but in the context of news. And basically what news personalization does, it allows new legacy media, as well as, let's say, social media news aggregators to disseminate news in the individualized manner, basically offering a specific selections of news to yourself. What we did specifically is we used document analysis in order to look at the attitudes towards personalization among Ukrainian scholars and journalists. And what we found through this document analysis is that there is definitely mostly positive attitudes, which is not different from Russia and Belarus, which were another two countries that we looked at, with a major emphasis on those wonderful new recommender algorithms actually giving more choice to the audience, but also increasing profits of the journalistic outlets. And I would say that it's definitely something that a lot of Ukrainian media, unfortunately, very much worrying about, because there is definitely a lot of issues with profits as well as the sustainability of the journalistic models in the country. What we also find pretty interesting is that there was not so much discussion of the role of the algorithmic personalization in the conflict reporting, even while we can assume that there is actually quite some potential for it. Because when you're thinking about the whole idea of the personalization, that basically the algorithm selecting a specific selection of news for yourself, then it can do a lot of wonderful things, also including the ways the conflict is reported about. It can, for instance, counter certain ideological prejudices that you're having, as actually pretty much every one of us probably has. It can also close your knowledge gaps about what is going on in the context of the conflict. It can also very recently update you about the latest development. And what we also found pretty interesting in this context is that compared with Belarusian and also Russian journalistic communities, the Ukrainian journalistic community was the only one which actually discussed algorithms and the recommender system in the context of the information warfare, which also tells you something about that there are certainly differences between the regional journalistic communities, also when they think about what can be the role of the modern technology in the context of the conflict. Finally, our latest story. It is from one of our ongoing projects when we're actually looking at the search results for the Ukraine conflict query. And this experiment was actually conducted in February 2020 for a selection of the search engines. But for now, my students actually coded on these research engines, Yahoo, Baidu, which is a Chinese search engine, and also Bing. And we still have to look at the Yandex and the Google, which probably would be the most interesting points of the comparison. But what we can actually see is that when we're actually using image search on the search engines for the query about the Ukraine conflict, we're very much getting, I would say, a very stylized image of the conflict. So we do not necessarily getting a lot of images of the destruction. We do not necessarily getting a lot of images of the suffering civilians, which is unfortunately a part of the conflict. But what we are getting very much is the images of the combatants, the images of the maps, which probably would appease our geographers, and also the images of the military vehicles, which is also something that we observed, for instance, in the way the pro-Ukrainian communities on social media report the conflict in the eastern Ukraine. So what it also all tells us currently, pretty much what we observe from our series of studies is that social media such as Contakte enables rather ideologically segregated news consumption with little overlap between news communities. Not very surprising, but pretty depressing. We also found that news personalization is viewed quite positively by the Ukrainian practitioners, especially in the field of journalism, in particular in the context of increasing profits. Albeit there are also some concerns about its use for the information warfare. However, what we also find surprising and to a certain degree disappointing, there is very little discussion of how we can actually enhance conflict reporting with the use of the algorithm and modern technology. And finally, when we're actually looking at the search algorithms, then we find that they very much focus on the images of the combatants, maps, and vehicles, with some differences between the individual agents, but with very little presence of more graphic detail. And now, and this is my last slide, what we still do not know and what actually I argue that we might want to know. One of the questions that I would still say is very important to think, both in terms of the general, I would say, context, but also in the case of Ukraine, and I agree it's particularly relevant considering all the developments which are going on currently, is how to counter ideological segregation, in particular as platforms ban doesn't necessarily exclude them from the local media ecosystems and partisanship still persists. So we can definitely ban, for instance, Contakte. We already have quite a lot of other platforms banned, but you find that they're still used and they still pretty much disseminate partisan views and actually fuel those partisan views. The second question that we do not know, and the questions that I actually would love to know, is how we can make news personalization algorithms help us to achieve better reporting of the conflict in Eastern Ukraine. And in order to answer this question, we should actually answer the question what we understand as a better reporting and how we actually teach it to the machines. Because we can definitely teach a lot of wonderful things to the algorithm, but then we actually need first to identify what we actually want to teach them. And the final question that I'm also very much interested in is what actually determines how such algorithms decide how to frame the conflict. It's something that we're actually talking a lot in the context of the legacy media and human journalists, but in the case of the algorithms, we're already having this problem because we do not necessarily understand their motivation either. What are our expectations when actually searching for the Ukraine conflict in the Google or Yandex? What actually want to expect, what we actually shall get? And finally, can Ukrainians actually influence it? And actually shall they actually influence the choices of that algorithm makes for representing a specific conflict or specific developments in the context of Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mikola. And I think, the last question that you closed with, the ability to shape these forms of selection, to teach the algorithms in the sense, who will be doing the teaching, who will be shaping this choice making, I think is a very relevant one. And, certainly I think the broader question there is that these processes, I assume are also cumulative, in terms of shaping orientations, so I'm kind of thinking about, how this relates to some of the surveys that John was describing, in his presentation, because, over time, certainly this process of selection and, kind of closed, news communities will become, I think, increasingly more isolated, which would be my assumption. But, I think definitely a whole series of questions there. So thanks so much for that. And staying very much with questions of the importance of news media, of political communication, I wanted to give the floor to our final speaker in this round, Joanna Szostak, who is a lecturer in political communication at the University of Glasgow, and who has been looking specifically at the role of news media, the role of mass media in relations between states, particularly in the post-Soviet region. She's actually currently working on a British Academy project looking at engagement, different levels of engagement with both local, national, and transnational media, and how these differ across different areas, different regions of Ukraine. So Joanna, the floor is yours, and I don't know if you wanted to show some slides or if you wanted to speak slideless, but the floor is yours regardless.
Thank you. No, I will speak slideless, and sort of hopefully pull together some of the research that I've been doing over the past couple of years and describe it as best I can without slides. I'm pleased to be able to follow from Mikola because I'm fascinated by his research, and I think one of the interesting things that we can talk about hopefully in the conversation that follows is how researchers using different methods and sort of using different data can reach somewhat different conclusions, because I've also been looking at this role of the media in shaping political communities within Ukraine, but unlike Mikola, who's very much looking at online platforms, Kontakte and so on, I've relied more on survey data. So what media Ukrainian survey respondents report using, and so I'm focused less exclusively on the online world, but kind of looking more at media repertoires that include TV. And I think if you include TV and the various different kinds of media, you can reach slightly different conclusions in terms of the level of segregation that exists in the Ukrainian audience. So that's what I'll sort of speak about with for my 5 minutes or so. So yeah, this role of the media in shaping political communities in Ukraine. And I think the aspect of that question which concerns people the most, particularly at the moment, amidst all these sort of heightened tensions, is, do the media contribute to dividing Ukraine? Do they contribute to sort of creating different segregated communities? Or to what extent do different kinds of media generate division, reinforce division, perhaps fuel pro-Moscow sentiment, fuel anti-Kiev sentiment, and fuel distrust more generally? The caveat I'll make before I kind of make a few points from my research is that all my comments today relate only to government-controlled Ukraine. I think some of the speakers mentioned earlier that it's important to be clear, are we including Crimea and the separatist-held territories or not? And I am not, because I haven't worked in the occupied territories of Ukraine. So yeah, the comments I make are about government-controlled Ukraine. And the first point that I will make is that people who know about Ukraine will know that the media landscape there is competitive. It's heterogeneous. And most Ukrainians can access all kinds of political views if they really want to, if they try to, and that ranges right from the staunchly Ukrainian nationalist views right through to the staunchly pro-Kremlin views, and everything that falls in between those. And this heterogeneity still exists, even though successive Ukrainian governments have tried very hard over the past 8 years to ban and block certain TV channels and websites. The contact here was mentioned, these sites and channels that are associated with Russian propaganda and pro-Russian propaganda. And the survey data suggests that the blocks and the bans on Russian content and on sort of pro-Russian media have been effective to some degree in reducing use of those sources within Ukraine. But as Mykola made clear, they haven't cut off access to those sources entirely. So there is a proportion of the Ukrainian population, it's not a particularly large proportion, but it's not insignificant, that is continuing to watch Russian TV channels, mostly via satellite. And a larger proportion who are continuing to access some of the banned Russian websites. And there's also, beyond the sort of big name Russian sources, TV channels, websites that we kind of perhaps are familiar with, there's also an unknown number of lower profile news websites within Ukraine that present themselves as Ukrainian, but promote very much the same narratives that the Kremlin promotes, and those aren't yet blocked. And the total audience of those kinds of sites is quite difficult to estimate, but it's a source of concern, I think, in terms of Ukraine's resilience to Russian information influence. And so given this heterogeneity, this access to all these different kinds of sources and different kinds of narratives, it does follow that Ukrainians can, if they want to, enclose themselves in what you might call echo chambers. And I think this has been a big concern for policymakers in the West. Regularly speak to people who are worried about, perhaps Russian-speaking Ukrainians tuning in exclusively to pro-Russian media and being, dangerously misled and having no source to kind of correct them. But if you look at the survey research that, gathers information about, the full range of news media that people are using, not just online, but also TV, radio, papers, and so on, there's actually not that much evidence of pro-Russian echo chambers in which people filter out the pro-Ukrainian sources entirely, right? So it's actually more common to find people who listen to Russian sources alongside the mainstream Ukrainian sources, usually mainstream Ukrainian TV, without trusting either the sort of Russian sources or the Ukrainian ones. So my reading, and others may challenge me, is that if there is a divide in the Ukrainian audience, it's less between one side that listens exclusively to Moscow and another side that listens exclusively to Kiev. It's rather between Ukrainians who completely don't engage with any pro-Russian news sources, which is the majority of people in Ukraine, and a minority of Ukrainians who will continue to engage with both Ukrainian sources and pro-Russian sources without necessarily trusting either side. And of course, we're interested in, what does all this mean for Ukrainian public opinion, for geopolitical imaginaries and so on. And judging the impact of news sources of the media on public opinion is always quite a difficult thing to do. But the sense that I get from my research is, and this is from both qualitative research in focus groups and interviews and also the surveys, is that the Russian and the pro-Russian sources are reinforcing the existing kind of grievances of people who dislike the government in Kiev and its policies. So when I interviewed Ukrainians about their news consumption, I quite often hear them say that they were, fed up with the government in Kiev. They were angry about the state of the country. And so when they encountered stories in pro-Russian sources which criticized the Ukrainian government and emphasized how terrible everything was in Ukraine, there's a section of the audience that for whom those kinds of narratives resonate. I guess it's not so much trust, but it's a resonance that you get the sense of. And so, is there a kind of, to what degree is there a problem of, a pro-Russian section of the news audience, the media audience in Ukraine? The other thing is to be clear about what we mean by pro-Russian, because I I don't get the sense from surveys that Ukraine has large sections of the population that are massive Putin fans and would welcome a Russian invasion. But there are quite significant parts of the population, particularly in certain regions, that are sympathetic to parts of the Kremlin narrative, and particularly the parts that are critical of Ukraine's current government. And in that sense, they do represent something of a problem, weakness, perhaps, for Ukraine's resilience. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for that. And I think, what is really important to me listening to you is, and I think, kind of going back to our opening comments, is, realizing that people to quite a large degree are making these choices about their media consumption. And I think this also kind of prevents us from falling into, the other trap, not just, kind of making Ukraine into just a symbol, but making Ukrainians into just, kind of these, pawns, also informational pawns who cannot make their own choices about the media that they're consuming. And I think, both what you were saying, what Nicola was saying, in terms of the range of media available and the choices that people are making for a variety of reasons, I think this is really important to keep in mind. So I was wondering if any of the speakers, before we open, and we've got several questions already hanging, wanted to respond. And Olya, you were the first to go, so you have the privilege of responding since everybody came after you.
Yes.
Go for it.
And I believe I was also sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, I believe I was also the only one who respected the 5 minutes maximum. So I wanted to now exhaust my extra 5 minutes.
You absolutely have.
Thank you everyone for the contributions. I think this was a very diverse in terms of substance and opinion conversation. I want to go back to a few points or questions formulated, and some of them actually addressed to me too. One on Michael, when you were speaking about Ukraine, that you cannot join Europe because you are Europe, and that's actually people would love that in Ukraine, and people do love that in Ukraine. Like, we cannot join, we do not need to join, we don't need to prove anything, we are Europe. But unfortunately, that is being questioned by some, and is being questioned in a very aggressive manner, and is being used as a basis for intervention. At this moment, actual military intervention, but over the decades. Oh, sorry. I got a dry throat. When I was speaking to of the Ukraine as Ukraine narrative, we went, when we were digging into material, it actually linked up to a Ukrainian writer, excuse me, Les Podorevyansky, who was once asked in an interview, but how can Ukraine be a nation if it doesn't have a national idea? And he said, what do you mean? Ukraine does have a national idea, Vidhibitsa. And that's a very cursive word, which literally translates as fuck off. Ukraine has a national idea, just leave us alone and let us sort out things in peace. And that flows directly to the question posed by Gerard on Ukraine as Ukraine, which Ukraine? Well, I would say Ukraine that is an independent sovereign state and should have the liberty to decide on its own future. Again, going back to the Ukraine as Ukraine narrative, the notion there is not that we posit a certain vision of Ukraine that's fixed and static and determinate. And the idea is that we are a nation, we are a country, we're a young state, we have a civic notion of nation, because we're a multi-ethnic, extremely diverse country with diversity of opinion. And as everybody pointed out, John and Nicola and Joanna, it's a very diverse context. And the idea is that we have a right, just like every other country, to figure out our own laundry and to figure out who we are and where we want to move. And we have the right to do that in peace, figuratively and quite literally, unfortunately, in the last 10 years. Which then brings me to the discussion of the values by John, which I really liked. And I was wondering if there are, because I understood that this is a massive study, right? And you just gave us a glimpse of what has been done, and around the questions and the notions of Europeanness and the relatability, of the values held by Ukrainians with those usually identified with Europe. I wonder if there was among the survey questions on I feel European, I feel Russian, and I feel Asian. And then compared to I feel European, the measures, the responses we get in Europe itself, right? So in EU member states. Because, for example, just earlier this week, I was given a class to students about the European Union, and I pointed out that the levels of trust in the EU institutions are very low at 35%, but that actually makes it 15% higher than level of popular trust in national institutions, right? So everything, things, statistical data only can be truly appreciated in the context. And I wonder, if we can compare then. Because coincidentally, I was, for an article I'm currently writing with Gergana Nucheva and Asan Dandashli, we were going through public opinion in the Eastern Partnership countries. And I was just looking at the surveys by the EU, by the IRI, NDI, and the Democratic Initiative Foundation in 2021. And they bring back the highest ever support rates for EU membership in Ukraine. And they report increase across demographics and across regions. And even more surprising, highest ever support rates for NATO membership, which was usually kind of scoring very low. It's now above 50% for the first time ever, something like that. So again, that brings us back to, I believe what Michael was saying, geographic Europe versus institutional Europe, right? And does Ukraine have a liberty to be a Switzerland? Well, maybe it would want to be a Switzerland, but unfortunately, Russia is next door and is really opposed to the idea, right? So like all those things were linking up in my head as all of you were speaking, and I just wanted to jump in. And I will stop here to leave time for Q&A and for others to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Olya. And so I don't know who wants to respond. I mean, Jono, I know you had a question that was already partially answered in the Q&A regarding, this question about, feeling European. So I don't know if you want to respond,
I can respond
live to that, and also to what Olya was saying.
Yeah, I can respond to Olya. We do have a lot of questions, not just about feeling European, but we have questions about kind of orientation to Russia, and we have also questions about kind of geopolitical questions where people want Ukraine to be on an east-west scale. We've published about this in various places, but I just wanted to quickly share screen again. I don't know if that's possible, Louisa.
You should be, you should still have that possibility.
Okay, just make sure I can do it. I don't see it. All right, well, let me just read it to you. We had a question, I'm a person of Russian civilization, right? And then we had Western civilization, we had European, and so on. And again, the data are for Ukraine and for Crimea. And for Crimea, over 80% of people agree with that proposition in Crimea, right? In Ukraine, in the areas that the government controls, the ratio is about 22%. And then disagreeing with the idea in Crimea, it's a total of about 10%, but in Ukraine, it's about 60%. So it's pretty consistent. The regional breakdown would be as I showed you before, and I guess what I'm trying to stress more than anything is the complexity, I suppose, of the Ukraine story. It's not a simple story. And Jared, of course, with these various nested Matryoshka dolls model indicates how complex it is in its various dimensions, but it's also complex within Ukraine. And that's the emphasis of our work to date. And there's more to come. And watch the Washington Post tomorrow or Thursday, and you will see much more recent data from Donbass, not from Ukraine as a whole. I do want to take, by the way, challenge Olya's report of the Democratic Initiative. About 45%, I think you said, or 43% of people would oppose the Russian forces should they arrive. I think that's a vastly exaggerated number, and our results for the same question in Donbass is actually less than 10%. Even in the government-controlled area. So it's one of those data survey responses, results that really get into the weeds about how the survey was done, where it was done, what was the exact nature of the question, and so on. And obviously there's a battle of survey results going on in Ukraine right now, especially the argument that Ukrainians have really shifted towards support for NATO, for joining NATO. And again, I am not as convinced as others that the shift has been as dramatic as it seems to indicate. Some people seem to indicate. I'll stop there.
I don't know
if I may just quickly, to clarify, John was did right. What I was saying is that 43% of Ukrainians are ready to engage in one form or another. Of them, 10.5% are ready to join the armed forces of Ukraine at the war front. 9% would join the volunteer military forces, and another 23% would be willing to provide all possible non-military assistance. So indeed, it's that 43% are ready to jump into the battle, but that they are willing to jump in the resistance, so to say. So you were exactly right to point that out, and perhaps I ran over it too quick.
But, I think this raises a really important question, and I'm looking, we've got a number of questions in the Q&A, some hands up as well. And, one question that I think is directly related to what you've been saying actually comes from Professor Stan Brunn, who is asking, is this war more of an information than a military war? And how do you win it? And I think, what both Olya, you and John were saying, about these competing surveys. A lot of the stuff that I've been reading in the past days, there seem to be more journalists and surveyors in Ukraine right now than others on the ground. And so it is very much, and also from what all of you have been saying, very much, an information battle as well. I don't know if I want to use the term war, and to what degree can we understand that and disentangle that, beyond from what some of you have already said, and how can we go, beyond, we've been talking about competing understandings, representations, media communities within Ukraine, but those are certainly very much present in the broader debate about Ukraine. And I see we also have more hands up. Joanna, go for it.
Okay, I think Michael should probably come in next because he raised his hand before me, but...
Sorry, and it's I'm trying to look at the participants, at you guys, so just yell at me. I'm too many hours on Zoom, I'm going blind.
I'll keep it short so Michael can have his say as well. Yeah, this idea of an information war is everywhere, right? And has been everywhere since, not just since 2014, even before that, Ukrainians were very much concerned about the use of information as a weapon. And I don't think there's any doubt that Russia looks at information as a weapon and is concerned about, Western powers using information against Russia. And then in turn, Russia tries to, use information as a weapon itself. The problem with this whole framework of thinking about news and information as a weapon is, for the Ukrainians caught in the middle of the information war, is it really makes it impossible to trust anything. Because if everyone is using information as a weapon, who's left, providing the factual, good information that people can kind of base rational decisions on? And so my concern is that the more people talk about information war, the more it's sort of part of people's understanding of how politics works in this part of the world is the more that you kind of give up on the idea that people can, form rational judgments on the basis of good information. So, I think the question in the Q&A was referring to, what would it mean to win this information war? If you kind of leave the information war kind of framework behind, for me, I think what Ukraine, perhaps might consider aiming for is a situation where there's more trust, building trust in reliable sources, strengthening those reliable sources within Ukraine that, aren't so, necessarily partisan. Certainly, a situation where the oligarchs have less influence, which is also a problem, not just the potential for Russian disinformation to get through, but the fact that so many media in Ukraine are used to political parties by the super rich, political purposes by these sort of very rich businessmen. So, in terms of end goal to aim for, that, a media environment where trust is possible, for me would be what would be a good end goal for Ukraine to aim for.
Thanks for that, Michael, and thank you for your patience.
Louisa, it may be irresponsible of me to add yet another question to the many that we have in our midst, but I wanted to ask those who had empirical knowledge of Ukraine, which is a wonderful thing to have, and sort of not as widely accessed as it should be, to be sure. But I wanted to ask about urban-rural divides. I mean, of course, one's very familiar in conversations about Ukraine about regional divides, but it seems to me, inferring a little bit from the American experience, the most European places in the United States are the cities, and the least European places are the places that are not cities. And I wonder if that's not a divide that's operative in Ukraine as well, that one might feel closer to Europe in a sense. One has education, a degree of wealth, and lives in a city, and you might have a different orientation. Although you might live very close to the city, you might have a different geographic and political, cultural orientation if one lives in the countryside.
So thanks for that. And John, it speaks in part to some of your research, but then after you're done responding, I'd like to actually pass on to Gerard and his nested scales, because that goes directly to one question that we've had in the chat from Professor Vladimir Kolosov, asking about, the importance of these scales. And to my mind, these scales take on different roles, different importance in different locations, even within Ukraine. But John, I don't know if you want to say something to the urban-rural divide.
Not a lot. I'll send Michael separately the breakdown. So, but in general, you're right. How big it is, I don't know. I think that's probably the best way to summarize it. But I'll run a quick crosstabs and send it to you.
So we have data processing on the spot. What more can you ask for?
Well, not on the spot, after we get off.
Almost. But I would like to go to the question that we've had from Professor Vladimir Kolosov to Gerard, but I think, in many ways speaking to a lot of the questions we've been raising, kind of thinking of, that nested diagram that Gerard, you showed us during your presentation, and to what degree, the different scales, the different, layers matter, perhaps differently. What Professor Kolosov asks is, what is the correlation between them? Are some of them autonomous? Or do we need to, in fact, think of all of these different scales together?
Yeah, this is extremely challenging to think through the relationship of the scales to each other. So the Matryoshka doll metaphor that is often used and is sort of reinforced in the diagram that I sent out there doesn't quite get at the entwined nature. And so what do I mean by that? The Russian state is a player in the Donbass conflict, so it's never simply just a local conflict. Russia is also a crucial player in the Ukrainian debate over its national ideal, because that debate is between, in very simple terms, a vision of Ukraine where Russia is the other versus a vision of Ukraine where Russia is a brother. And Russia then is a great power that is feeling insecure because of the encroachment of NATO towards Russia's borders. And we have to acknowledge the fact that there has been a push by NATO members, especially the Baltic states and Poland and others, to support Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. So there's been a geopoliticization of Ukraine and Ukrainian identity. So what Olya asks for, which is perfectly legitimate, that Ukraine be allowed to work out its own debate and conflict over its history and move towards a vision of civic national identity which captures its diversity. That is taking place, that particular debate is taking place within the geopolitical pressure cooker. And it's inevitably geopoliticized. And as a consequence, it has fractured the country so that now you have former Ukrainians who are now Russian citizens, and the vision that Ukrainian state wants, on the one hand, to say that's part of Ukraine, but it doesn't want to take into consideration the fact that if they're saying that's part of Ukraine, then that changes what Ukraine's geopolitical orientation is, because they do not share the geopolitical orientation of those in Kiev. So therefore, there's a contradiction there. You cannot have an expansive notion of the Ukrainian state, which takes all of the people into consideration, and then say that Ukraine is united in opposition to Russia, because it's not, because the country is divided as a consequence of being in a geopolitical pressure cooker.
So I don't know if anybody wants to respond to this or add anything to this, Olya or others, but I guess, I'm looking also at the other questions that are in the chat. I mean, there is, certainly one regarding to decolonization and what this may mean. And, I'm inventing a term on the fly here, de-geopoliticization, if there is such a thing. And then if that's even possible, I mean, or if it's absurd. I mean, Jared, you very often say that, we're talking here about a very unfortunate geography. Of course, as geographers, we're well trained not to be geographical determinists, but in this sense, unfortunate geographies do make a difference, and to these wider geopolitical contexts. So can we not only decolonize, but also de-geopoliticize some of this discussion?
It would be lovely if we could afford the luxury, right? Yes, right. I think it would be fantastic. I really like what Gerald, I don't know if that's in your book or if you just pinpointed it, pinned it down now, the geopolitical pressure cooker. I think that describes the concept beautifully, because there are like different processes that require peace and thinking and, freedom of thought, so to say, for the people, and require time. But there is this constant geopolitical pressure cooker, most of the time not on the initiative, of Ukraine itself, that, within this context, things have to happen, right? And as we were speaking earlier on the values or this or that, it would be fantastic if we had the luxury of time and the luxury of human resources and financial resources to invest into working on the values, rather than into, equipping the army and things like that. I think that was, like going back to whether we could decolonize and de-geopoliticize, right? It would involve, we probably could, and we definitely should. Now, whether we would is the question, because that would require all parties to have a conversation at the same level. And I'm now thinking of this old joke, that, it's like playing chess with a pigeon. The pigeon will like toss over all the figurines, poo on the board, fly away and say, I did you at chess, and that's a little bit, what's happening when different, actors are playing different game, and Ukraine is there like, we want to formulate a national idea, and Russia's like, boom, we're going to chop off a piece. So, you can suddenly the conversation is completely redirected and redesigned. And I just wanted to emphasize also something, because we constantly come back to the divisions within Ukraine, and there is no denying that there are divisions within Ukraine. There are divisions within any society, any community, and any country. The fact that Ukraine is divided, or the fact that a country has a diversity, is diverse or divided, does not make it any less of a country, right? It should be up for Ukraine to figure out how it wants to deal with its own diversity. It's not like, Democrats and Republicans are divided, it's time for Canada to chop off Alaska. Nobody would come up with this, conversation. It's absurd. And that's more or less what we have. Ukraine is divided. It's now okay for Russia to chop off Crimea. No, it's just as absurd as Canada chopping off Alaska. So I just wanted to, to point that out. And I'll pass the floor to others. I saw there was another question in the Q&A about civic mobilization within Russia and how that's perceived in Ukraine. I don't know if, Luisa, you want to allow time for that?
I mean, if you want to quickly respond to that, that would be great, because that was directed at you.
Yeah. So there's very little civic mobilization within Russia. There definitely is some, but it's very sporadic and ad hoc. And I personally know a lot of individuals, but these are rather individuals than civic protests, right? So I think in Ukraine, the general sentiment is that there isn't really hope that there will be a massive protest in Russia that will stop this. There's rather amazement with how can they, like, how gullible are they? Like, how strong is the propaganda? How come there is no protest? And they say, okay, there's these tens of thousands of troops around the border. What is the motivation of the soldiers? I mean, what is the political instructors telling the soldiers, like, what is the cause, let's say, for invasion? Like, what is their motivation? How are the parents not with calling back the conscribed sons? How are the wives not like taken back? So it's rather the amazement, like, how can this be happening? How can there not be resistance internally? Or how can it be that even if there's resistance, that we see none of it, right? And if there are like little acts, I don't know, of solidarity, celebrities signing letters, you know, calling on the government to not do this, you know, like with Makarevich and others, it's seen favorably, but of course, everybody understands that this has no impact on the course of events. So yeah, that's another thing that would be wonderful if only Russians would participate in resisting the Russian government with the rest of us.
Well, and you know, and it would be interesting to see, you know, if you know, once a military offensive were launched, you know, what would be indeed the reaction. But I very much appreciated your two very geographical points. One, I like your idea of the pigeon on the chessboard much more than like the Brzezinski style grand chessboard. I think I'm going to think of the pigeon on the chessboard now. This will become part of my geopolitical imaginary, much better. But also the point that you're making, which is really important. I mean, this idea that somehow a fractured, fragmented country is not a proper country. As you know, we can't, you know, and that is, I mean, you know, kind of thinking of various, you know, national imaginaries. It's a very powerful idea that definitely, you know, kind of colonizes our geopolitical understandings as well. But I know both Joanna and Michael have been patiently waiting. So Joanna, on to you.
Thanks. I just wanted to briefly pick up on the sort of decolonizing question that was there, and also on, you know, the idea of, I guess, how Ukraine goes about building a sort of unifying civic identity, which I think Gerard mentioned at one point. I've been asking, some of the questions that I've been asking in my surveys relate to what it means to be a good Ukrainian citizen. You know, how do Ukrainians answer that question? And in terms of, you know, many of the things, you know, I've been asking this question in different regions, from east to north to west and so on. And in the center, Kiev, and there's actually quite a lot of common ground. You know, you see this huge support for, you know, knowledge of Ukrainian culture and history, knowledge of Ukrainian language. All these things are sort of central to what it means to people's understanding of being a good Ukrainian citizen. The one area where you see, well, in terms of the questions I've asked, at least, where you see really marked difference is whether knowing the Russian language is also part of being a good Ukrainian citizen. And here you see, you know, well, particularly in Odessa region, which I've looked at, sort of figures that are at least twice as high as in Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine, that people there think knowing Russian is also part of being a good Ukrainian citizen. Whereas, you know, in Kiev, you'd have very few people sort of expressing that point of view. And I think, you know, this links to this question of decolonizing, because, you know, that there is a minority in Ukraine that wouldn't accept that Ukraine was really a colony that needs to be decolonized. So this, the work that's been done, you know, to promote Ukrainian language and culture, to promote sort of that kind of thing, meets some resistance amongst the minority, which is sort of the challenge with this whole decolonizing, I guess, debate in Ukraine. So I'll keep that short, because I know we've got lots of questions.
Thanks so much for that. Michael.
I love the question about whether we can geopoliticize the questions we've been discussing. And I think it very much depends on who the we is. I think for policymakers, obviously not, because there really aren't many other terms in which to think about the current crisis. But for the rest of us, we're not sort of under those obligations. So I think that we not only can, but we really should. We should open our imaginations to other frameworks and other ways of thinking about geography, identity, and belonging in Ukraine. But I just wanted to add, as a kind of footnote, or perhaps as a further question, when it comes to the policymakers and to the public journalistic discussion of what's happening, you know, it's an intelligent revision to sort of change the crisis from a Ukraine crisis to a Russia crisis. But what happens semantically if you shift it to a Europe crisis? I'm at times a little bit skeptical about the language of crisis in general. It seems to have its own rules and etiquettes, but perhaps that's what we're really thinking about. It's a crisis of where Europe ends and begins, of who's included and who's not, sort of the extent of Europe, the scope of it, the structure. And, it's sort of intellectually fascinating if by Europe you mean what we conventionally think of as Europe. We think as well of Ukraine and of Russia as all sort of members of the European house. And it's the house itself that's experiencing a set of difficulties. But those are, to borrow Gerald's imagery, sort of nested terms: Ukraine crisis, Russia crisis, Europe crisis.
And, and it's really interesting because, I was kind of joking at the start that now, the new kind of term is, kind of the European security order, European security architecture. And we're talking about European security and Russia in European security, where, as you all well know, I mean, the role of the EU itself has been marginal, if not marginalized. And if anything, once more presented as conflicted, inconsistent, incapable, and so on. So I think, that semantic choice is very important. And I mean, I'm with you on, kind of the question of crisis, but we do have a crisis. I don't know what else to call it now, but that is certainly it. We've got, we're already well over time, and a number of questions asking, though, us to speculate. Our colleague Fabrizio Eva is asking regarding the status of Crimea or the status of the borders. We've got another question regarding, the extent of the current military threat. As I said, I will I'll use my chair prerogative here to preclude us from answering those because we are not military analysts. We are not in the business of predictions. I think, what we have tried to do is think about all the many other things underlying some of these speculations, some of these representations, which have been extremely powerful in the past weeks and months in shaping our understanding, not just of what has happened, what is happening, but of what could happen. And I think, again, thinking of geopolitical representations, of imaginations, whether of Ukraine, but also, by Ukrainians. I mean, the sort of imaginations, understandings that we've tried to draw out tonight. Hopefully, we have been able to give a little bit more of a voice to those. So conscious of the time and also our valiant technical support that is working at 9:30 p.m. I don't want to keep them any longer. Thank you everyone very, very much for staying with us for over an hour and a half to talk about these questions. Doubtless we will keep talking about them. Thanks so much, especially to the panelists who've taken time out of their very busy schedules. I know lots of you are fielding countless questions about what is happening. So thanks for sharing your time with us and not others, because I know it is very much a trade-off. And thanks so much for leaving us with I think, also some different imaginaries. From pigeons, I mean, the pigeon is not going away, Olya, but also very different imaginaries.
My apologies for that.
No, I mean, it's, I think, let's say, we need to bring some, kind of other kind of natural metaphors that are not the usual ones that have, colored geopolitical imaginations of the past. So I will leave it at that. Thanks so much, everyone. Again, John, I see a hand up.
Yeah, Louisa, quickly, can I make a plug for our Canon presentation?
Make a plug, absolutely.
So next Wednesday, around noon, I think it's going to be Eastern time, we will present the first results of our big Donbass survey, which we just finished a couple of weeks ago with Jared and I and Gwen Sassa. We'll do it then. So everybody is welcome, and we'll have some very interesting and I think controversial results.
So this will be kind of lunchtime-ish.
Wednesday the 23rd. Yeah.
Wednesday the 23rd. So we will try to send out a link through our Twitter feed as well, and certainly share it with those of you who have followed us today. Great. Thanks again, and